Lord, the sun has set, and the world's weight is slipping from my shoulders. I am about to close my eyes and drift into sleep. But I cannot let the day die without kneeling in the sanctuary of your presence. The stillness of this room wraps around me, just as your tender mercy wraps around my weary soul. I lift my heart to you now, not with rehearsed poetry, but with a raw, trembling sincerity rising from the very depths of my being. Thank you for this day that has passed into memory. Thank you for every second, whether bathed in your radiant light or veiled in heavy shadows. Lord, I do not want to speak in the polished language of old books. I want to speak with the aching honesty of a child who just wants to be held. I am here in the sacred, quiet hours, bringing no grand demands, carrying only a heart that whispers, I feel you in everything, even in my brokenness. Thank you for never abandoning me in the chaotic rush of my days, especially when I was convinced I walked entirely alone. Thank you for the times I stopped chasing worldly illusions, only to realize true peace waited in the quiet shadow of your wings. Thank you for stumbles that felt like devastating falls, but were actually your hands training me to stand stronger. Thank you for painful lessons learned not from books, but from scars that have become beautiful medals of my survival, proving your grace is sufficient for me. Thank you for the microscopic mercies my blind eyes overlook. Thank you for the gentle whisper in my spirit when I forget my name, reminding me my worth is anchored in you, my Creator, not in fleeting achievements or the fickle opinions of men. Thank you for seasons of deep distress, for they carved a deeper capacity within me to cherish your relief. Thank you for dull, gray days, for they taught my soul to fiercely appreciate the vibrant beauty of your joyful seasons, reminding me that you are the author of my joy. You know the nights I fought your providence, growing bitter at your timing, weeping while the winds blew against my fragile desires. But tonight, I thank you because you refused my short-sighted wishes, answering the truest needs of my soul instead. Thank you for heavy doors you shut, which I thought were my salvation, only to reveal vast paths I'd never find otherwise. Thank you for your profound silence, which forced me to listen to my spirit, and for moments you felt distant, driving me to seek you within my heart rather than the world's empty noise, teaching me that your presence is my truest home. Thank you for not making me a flawless statue, but a breathing human who knows how to crawl back to your feet after every failure. Thank you for your infinitely spacious heart that tolerates my stumbles, and your gentle hands gathering my shattered pieces when life's storms batter me. Thank you for difficult people who mirrored my hidden pride, and every situation that stripped my ego, forcing me to my knees in beautiful humility, shaping me into the person you always intended me to be. Lord, my heart overflows with gratitude too vast for words. Thank you that I can close my eyes tonight, unburdened, knowing I am not tasked with holding the universe together. Thank you for being the almighty guardian who never slumbers, and guarantor of a tomorrow I haven't seen. Thank you for making life a sacred pilgrimage, not a frantic race, and allowing me to be a traveler holding your hand, rather than wandering alone in the dark. I lay down this day's remnants at your feet, with all failures I hid and victories I claimed. Thank you for loving me exactly as I am, embracing the complex mess of my personality and the simple purity of my spirit. Another quiet night fades, and I am more certain than ever that you are woven into my life's very fabric. Thank you for simply being, because in you I truly live, breathe, and am. You are my beginning and my endless end. Amen.